Hey guys, tonight we begin with silk cushions, distant cannon fire, and the gentle administrative hum of a 16th century superpower. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket. Imagine the soft flicker of oil lamps reflecting off tiled palace walls, and let's slowly drift back to the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Specifically, we're settling in with one man, a man who was called the Magnificent in Europe and the Lawgiver at home, which is already a lot of branding for one person. Tonight, we're following the entire life of Suleiman the Magnificent, conqueror, poet, husband, occasional overthinker, and, as it turns out, a surprisingly dramatic father. Suleiman was born in 1494 in the coastal city of Trabzon. His father was Selim I. Now, Selim I was not what you would call mellow. He was intense. He was decisive. He was the kind of man who solved succession disputes by removing the competition permanently. Ottoman succession law at the time was less wait your turn and more last prince standing, so family dinners were tense. Young Suleiman grew up in this atmosphere of silk robes and quiet paranoia. He was educated carefully. Languages, poetry, military tactics, governance, the standard prince package. He learned Persian and Arabic. He wrote poetry under a pen name. Yes, a pen name, because when you're a future absolute ruler, subtlety is thrilling. Unlike some royal children who spent their days chasing falcons and ignoring homework, Suleiman seems to have taken his education seriously. He governed provinces as a teenager, which was the Ottoman version of an internship, just with more cavalry. In 1520, Selim I died. Some say from illness, others whisper stress. Honestly, ruling an expanding empire while eliminating rivals probably does raise the blood pressure. Suleiman was 26 years old when he became sultan, and unlike many transitions in Ottoman history, this one was smooth. No brothers to strangle, no cousins mysteriously disappearing, just a calm, efficient transfer of absolute power. Very relaxing, for once. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was already enormous. It stretched across Anatolia, the Balkans, parts of the Middle East, and North Africa. But Suleiman looked at that map and thought, gently, we could add a bit more. One of his early moves was against Hungary, specifically the fortress city of Belgrade. It fell in 1521. A few years later, in 1526, he faced the Hungarian king at the Battle of Mohacs. Now, I promised no dramatic action, so let's describe this in the calmest way possible. The Hungarian forces were overwhelmed. Thoroughly. Their king, Louis II of Hungary, ended up drowning while fleeing, which is not how anyone wants their biography to conclude. With Hungary destabilized, Suleiman casually extended Ottoman influence deeper into Central Europe. He even knocked on Vienna's door in 1529, literally laid siege to it. The siege didn't succeed. Weather, supply lines, stubborn defenders, these things happen. Even magnificent sultans have off days. Back home, though, Suleiman was not just conquering cities, he was reorganizing laws, hence the nickname the Lawgiver. He standardized legal codes across the empire, criminal law, taxation, land ownership. He wasn't abolishing Islamic law, but supplementing it with imperial regulations. It was bureaucratic, it was methodical, it was the kind of governance that makes historians nod approvingly. And here's where things become gently ironic. For all his military power, Suleiman's biggest life complications came from inside the palace, specifically from the harem, which was not just a romantic lounge of silk pillows as TV dramas might suggest. It was a political institution, structured, hierarchical, and emotionally complex. Enter Harem Sultan, also known in Europe as Roxolana. She was likely of Ruthenian origin, possibly captured during a Tatar raid. She entered the Imperial Harem as a slave concubine and then, in one of history's most dramatic glow-ups, became Suleiman's legal wife. Now, Ottoman sultans did not usually marry their concubines. Marriage created political alliances and complicated power balances. Concubines kept things simpler. Children were born, princes were sent to govern provinces, the cycle continued, clean, controlled. But Suleiman fell in love, or at least something very close to it. He freed Harem, he married her, he wrote poetry to her, actual love poems. Imagine being an all-powerful ruler, feared across continents, and still sitting at night composing rhyming verses about your wife's smile. It's oddly sweet. This decision changed everything, because Suleiman already had sons by another woman, Mehmed IV. Her son, Mustafa, was the obvious heir, competent, popular with the army, a classic crown prince archetype, calm, capable, slightly too popular perhaps. Harem, meanwhile, had her own sons, and here we gently float into one of the more uncomfortable traditions, fratricide. When a new sultan ascended, he was legally permitted to execute his brothers. The idea was brutal efficiency. One ruler, no civil war, very tidy, in theory. So succession was not just about prestige, it was life or death. Rumors began circulating. Court factions formed. Was Mustafa plotting rebellion, or was he simply existing too confidently? Historians debate. What we do know is that in 1553, during a campaign in Persia, Suleiman ordered Mustafa executed. The method was traditional, silent, controlled. Palace officials with a bowstring. Mustafa reportedly protested his innocence. The army was furious. They adored him, but the Sultan's word was final. Imagine that weight. Ordering the death of your own son because you suspect or fear he might one day threaten stability. It's not exactly cozy bedtime material, but we'll glide past the emotional turbulence and observe it quietly. Harem's influence at court grew. She corresponded with foreign leaders, she funded public works, hospitals, mosques, charitable foundations. She was politically active in a way previous consorts had not been. Some admired her intelligence. Others blamed her for palace intrigue. As always, powerful women in history receive complicated reviews. Eventually, Harem died in 1558. Suleiman was devastated. He had her buried in a grand mausoleum near the Suleymaniye Mosque, the architectural masterpiece he commissioned in Istanbul. Even in death, their connection was monumental, literally carved in stone. Now, let's gently consider Suleiman as a father in his later years. After Mustafa's death, the remaining sons were Selim and Bayezid. They did not get along, because, of course they didn't. Ottoman succession was not a team sport. Bayezid eventually rebelled against his brother Selim. Suleiman sided with Selim. Bayezid fled to Persia. Diplomatic negotiations followed. Eventually, Bayezid was handed back and executed, along with his sons. If you're noticing a pattern, you're not alone. The Ottoman method of ensuring stability was extremely committed to the concept of one surviving heir. Selim, the surviving son, would become Selim II. He was not quite his father, less military ambition, more appreciation for wine. History nicknamed him Selim the Sot, which is not a glowing endorsement. By the 1560s, Suleiman was elderly. He had ruled for over 4 decades. His empire was at its territorial height, from Budapest to Baghdad, from Crimea to the Red Sea, a massive, humming machine of administration, trade, and military presence. In 1566, at the age of 71, Suleiman set out on yet another campaign, because retirement is apparently for lesser monarchs. This one targeted the fortress of Sigedvar in Hungary. During the siege, Suleiman fell ill. He died in his tent before the fortress fell. His death was kept secret temporarily so the army wouldn't panic. Even in death, he was managed carefully. His internal organs were buried near the battlefield. His body was transported back to Istanbul for burial beside Harem. And that was the end of Suleiman's life. A reign of 46 years, legal reforms, monumental architecture, devoted poetry, strategic paranoia, and the quiet tragedy of sons who never quite made it safely to middle age. He left behind an empire at its peak, but also a succession system that guaranteed ongoing family tension, because when absolute power is the prize, brotherly love tends to fade. So as we gently close part 1, imagine the domes of Istanbul under a fading sunset, the call to prayer echoing softly, the aged sultan resting at last beside the woman he broke tradition to marry. An empire still vast, still confident, not yet aware that its golden age has already reached its quiet turning point. And in the next part, we'll float forward to another Ottoman ruler, another palace, another set of siblings eyeing each other with polite suspicion, because in this dynasty, there is always another son. Part 2. Suleiman II, the man who preferred the wine cellar. All right, settle back in. Adjust your pillow. Maybe lower the lights just a little more. We're still inside the vast, echoing corridors of the Ottoman Empire. The carpets are thick, the politics are thicker, and the throne has just passed to a man who is not quite his father. Suleiman the Magnificent is gone. The long shadow of his reign still stretches across 3 continents, and now, in 1566, his surviving son ascends the throne as Suleiman II. If Suleiman was the golden standard of warrior kings, Suleiman was more of a comfortable indoor enthusiast. He had grown up knowing exactly how fragile survival could be. His older half-brother Mustafa had been executed. His full brother Bayezid had rebelled and also been executed. Suleiman didn't win the throne by being the most dazzling prince. He won by being the last prince available, which in Ottoman politics absolutely counts. Now, Suleiman II is often remembered as Suleiman the Sot. That nickname came later, mostly from European observers who loved a tidy moral story about decline. Was he fond of wine? Yes. Did he enjoy palace comforts? Also yes. But to imagine him permanently wobbling through the halls with a goblet in hand is probably unfair. He was functional, just less energetic than his father. The interesting thing about Suleiman is that he ruled during the height of Ottoman power. The empire he inherited was enormous. The military machine was seasoned. The bureaucracy was efficient. It was like inheriting a perfectly tuned orchestra. All he had to do was not drop the conductor's baton. And honestly, he mostly didn't. One of the key differences between Suleiman and Suleiman was delegation. Suleiman was quite happy to let his grand viziers handle the heavy lifting. The most important among them was Sakoli Mehmed Pasha. Sakoli was experienced, intelligent, and deeply capable. He had served under Suleiman and understood the machinery of empire intimately. Under Suleiman, Sakoli essentially ran foreign and military policy, which allowed Suleiman to focus on, well, being sultan in a more relaxed sense. And this arrangement worked surprisingly well. For a while. One of the major events of Suleiman's reign was the Ottoman push to capture Cyprus from Venice. Cyprus was strategically valuable. It also produced excellent wine. Some historians gently note that Suleiman had a personal appreciation for Cypriot vintages. Whether that was a motivating factor or simply a poetic coincidence is up for debate. The Ottomans invaded Cyprus in 1570. It was a long campaign, eventually successful, but this expansion triggered a reaction from European powers. Enter the Holy League, a coalition organized by Pope Pius V, including Spain and Venice. Their fleets gathered, and in 1571, they clashed with the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto. Now, I promised no intense action scenes, so we'll describe Lepanto as a large and very decisive disagreement at sea. The Ottoman fleet was defeated, substantially. Ships destroyed, thousands killed or captured. It was one of the first major naval setbacks for the empire in a long time. Europe celebrated wildly. Paintings were commissioned, church bells rang. It felt, to many, like a turning point. But here's the part that history doesn't always emphasize. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. A year! That's what happens when you have vast resources, disciplined shipyards, and a bureaucracy that knows how to file paperwork efficiently. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha reportedly remarked that while the Christians had shaved off the empire's beard at Lepanto, the Ottomans had cut off one of their arms in Cyprus, and a beard, of course, grows back. Calm, slightly smug, very Ottoman. So while Lepanto was symbolically important, it didn't collapse the empire. Trade continued, administration functioned, taxes were collected with steady reliability. Back in the palace, Selim's domestic life was quieter than his father's dramatic entanglements. His most influential consort was Nur Banu Sultan. She would later become a powerful figure as queen mother. Ottoman court politics had evolved into what historians sometimes call the Sultanate of Women, a period when royal women wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. Selim, meanwhile, did not lead campaigns personally. He stayed in Istanbul. He oversaw, he delegated. He lived within the carefully layered world of Topkapi Palace, where hierarchy was precise and every glance carried meaning. There's something almost soothing about this stage of the empire. It's stable, predictable, structured. The wild expansion of earlier decades slows into maintenance mode. But of course, stability in an absolute monarchy depends entirely on succession, and Selim had sons. The most important of them was Murad. In 1574, Selim II died. The official cause was illness, though later rumors suggested he may have slipped in a bathhouse after drinking. Whether that detail is historical fact or just irresistible storytelling is unclear. It's almost too on the nose, isn't it? The wine-loving sultan undone by a bathhouse mishap. Regardless, he died at 50, not particularly old, not particularly young. His son ascended as Murad III, and here is where we gently drift into a different kind of royal dysfunction. Murad III began his reign by executing his brothers, all of them, 5 in total. This was standard Ottoman procedure by now, grim, efficient, meant to prevent civil war. Imagine starting your new job by eliminating your coworkers, permanently. It sets a tone. Murad was devout. He was also deeply influenced by palace women, particularly his mother, Nur Banu Sultan. The inner palace became an increasingly powerful political arena. Unlike Suleiman, Murad did not personally lead campaigns. Unlike Selim, he didn't entirely retreat into comfort either. Instead, his reign became known for something quieter but more corrosive: inflation and administrative strain. The late 16th century saw economic challenges across Europe and the Mediterranean. Silver flooding in from the Americas disrupted currency values. Prices rose, soldiers demanded higher pay. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, grew restless. There were revolts, not catastrophic, but unsettling. Murad himself preferred the interior life. He was fascinated by mysticism and correspondence. He wrote letters, he maintained a large harem, extremely large. He fathered over 100 children. Yes, 100. Ottoman reproductive strategy was apparently very thorough. Now, you might think that having that many sons would complicate succession, and you would be absolutely correct. When Murad died in 1595, his son Mehmed III ascended the throne, and in keeping with established tradition, Mehmed ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers. 19! If you're feeling a bit emotionally heavy, don't worry, we're not going to linger on the details. Just imagine the quiet corridors, the muffled footsteps, the absolute stillness afterward. This was the Ottoman solution to civil war: brutal clarity. By this point, the empire was still vast, still formidable, but something had shifted. The sultans were less visible on campaign. Court politics grew denser, the janissaries more influential. The rhythm of expansion had slowed into something more defensive. And yet, from the outside, the empire still gleamed. Diplomats still arrived in awe. The domes of Istanbul still shimmered over the Bosphorus. Markets bustled, scholars debated theology and science. Life continued with its ordinary texture. Selim II's reign, often dismissed as the beginning of decline, was in reality more complicated. It was a pivot point. The warrior-sultan model faded. The bureaucratic state deepened. Power shifted from battlefield charisma to palace negotiation. And in that quiet shift lies the strange softness of late 16th century Ottoman life. Less dramatic conquest, more whispered intrigue. As we gently close part 2, imagine Selim II not as a caricature of indulgence, but as a transitional figure. A man who inherited a blazing sun of an empire and simply kept it burning. Not brighter, not dimmer, just steady. The fleet was rebuilt, the borders held, the wine, presumably, was enjoyed. And in the next part, we'll float further into the increasingly intricate maze of palace politics. More sons, more mothers, more carefully managed silences. Because in the Ottoman world, the throne was never empty for long. Part 3. Mehmed III and the Era of Too Many Sons. All right, take a slow breath. Let the room stay quiet. We're still drifting through the long marble corridors of the Ottoman Empire. The carpets are still plush. The air still smells faintly of incense and administrative paperwork. And the throne, as always, has a new occupant. In 1595, that occupant became Mehmed III. Now, Mehmed III did not ease into power. He did not warm up with a gentle policy reform. He did not take a few days to reflect. No, he began his reign by ordering the execution of 19 of his brothers. 19. This remains one of the most extreme examples of Ottoman fratricide. It was legal, it was considered practical, it was framed as preventing civil war, but even by Ottoman standards, 19 felt excessive. Imagine the silence in the palace after that, a silence so thick it could practically be folded and stored. And with that, Mehmed III became the sole surviving son of Murad III, which sounds triumphant until you remember how many sons Murad had. Mehmed was not particularly trained for heroic battlefield leadership. He had spent much of his life inside the palace, protected, sheltered, surrounded by court tutors and carefully managed expectations. But the empire at this point needed visible strength. The late 16th century was not as comfortable as the days of Suleiman. There were wars with the Habsburgs. There were tensions in Hungary. There were internal rebellions known as the Salali Revolt in Anatolia. Inflation was nibbling away at stability. The janissaries were growing opinionated. So Mehmed did something his father and grandfather hadn't done in years. He personally led a military campaign. In 1596, he marched north during what is often called the Long Turkish War against the Habsburgs. And at the Battle of Mezokarestis, the Ottomans faced a serious challenge. For a moment, things looked grim. Ottoman forces began to retreat. The camp was nearly overrun. But then, and we'll keep this very calm, the tide shifted. Ottoman troops regrouped. They counterattacked. The Habsburg forces faltered. The Ottomans won. It was one of the last times an Ottoman sultan would personally command troops in battle, so Mehmed III, despite his anxious palace upbringing, briefly stepped into the older warrior king tradition. And then he went back home, because ruling from the palace was safer, and increasingly that's where power truly resided. Mehmed's reign, however, was overshadowed by his mother, Safiya Sultan. She had enormous influence. Foreign ambassadors knew it. Court officials knew it. She corresponded with rulers across Europe. Gifts flowed in and out of the palace.
The Ottoman court during this period is often described as being dominated by powerful women, mothers, wives, consorts, guiding inexperienced or inward-looking sultans. It's sometimes called the Sultanate of Women, which sounds dramatic, but in practice, it was more like an intricate web of alliances conducted behind carved wooden screens. Mehmed himself was not known for grand reforms or architectural marvels. He was cautious, possibly anxious, perhaps understandably so. Imagine growing up knowing your uncles were executed, watching your brothers disappear, and knowing at all times that survival depended on being the last one standing. It doesn't exactly build carefree confidence. He fathered many children. Among them was a boy named Ahmed. And here's where something interesting begins to shift. When Mehmed III died in 1603 at the age of 37, his son ascended as Ahmed I, 13. Now, by tradition, the new sultan would eliminate his brothers immediately. It was grim, yes, but efficient. The law allowed it. It was considered stabilizing. Ahmed had a younger brother named Mustafa, and for reasons historians still debate, perhaps youth, perhaps mercy, perhaps political calculation, Ahmed did not execute Mustafa. Instead, he imprisoned him. This marked a major turning point in Ottoman succession practices. Mustafa was confined in what became known as the kafes, or cage, not a literal metal cage, but a set of secluded palace apartments where potential rivals were kept under close watch, isolated, comfortable, technically, but removed from public life. Imagine spending years in quiet confinement knowing you might one day be called to rule the largest empire in the Mediterranean. No pressure. Ahmed I's reign was relatively stable, though the empire was no longer expanding dramatically. He focused on consolidating authority, managing internal unrest, and most famously, commissioning a mosque that would become one of Istanbul's defining landmarks. The Blue Mosque, officially known as the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, rose during his reign. With its cascading domes and 6 minarets, it remains one of the most recognizable symbols of Ottoman architecture. There's something poetic about a 13-year-old sultan eventually leaving behind one of the most serene buildings in the city. It feels like compensation for a childhood that was anything but serene. Ahmed died in 1617 at just 27 years old. And now, for the first time, the Ottoman throne faced a real test of its new succession logic, because Ahmed's sons were still young, and his brother Mustafa was alive. So the court did something unprecedented. They crowned Mustafa. Thus began the reign of Mustafa I. Mustafa had spent years in confinement, isolated, removed from political life, and when he suddenly emerged as sultan, it became clear that long-term callous isolation is not ideal for preparation for absolute rule. Contemporary accounts describe him as unstable, confused, easily manipulated. Whether this was mental illness, trauma from confinement, or simply hostile chroniclers exaggerating, we can't say for certain. What we do know is that his reign was short. He was deposed after only a few months. Ahmed II took the throne. Mustafa was returned to confinement. Yes, the empire now had a deposed former sultan quietly living in the palace, which does not simplify matters. Osman II, young and ambitious, attempted reforms. He wanted to curb the power of the Janissaries. This, as it turns out, was not a popular idea among the Janissaries. In 1622, they revolted. Osman II was deposed and then, tragically, executed. He was only 18. And so, in a move that feels almost circular, Mustafa I was brought back to the throne again. His second reign was just as unstable as the first, and once again, he was removed. At this point, if you're feeling slightly dizzy, that's understandable. Ottoman succession had moved from brutal clarity to something more experimental. Brothers were no longer automatically executed. Instead, they were confined and, occasionally, recycled. Eventually, another of Ahmed I's sons, Mehmed IV, would take power. But we'll let that story unfold slowly in the next part. For now, let's sit quietly with this transitional moment in Ottoman history.
Fratricide had been softened into confinement. Warrior sultans had become palace-raised rulers. Military glory had shifted into bureaucratic endurance. The empire was still vast, still formidable, but the energy had changed. It was less about charging across Europe and more about carefully managing tensions within marble walls. As we gently close Part 3, imagine the Bosphorus at dusk, ships moving slowly through the strait, palace windows glowing faintly. Somewhere inside, a former sultan sits in quiet isolation, unsure if history will call his name again. And in this dynasty, it usually does. Part 4. Murad IV, the sultan who banned coffee, because, obviously. All right, settle back in. Let your shoulders relax. The palace corridors are still echoing softly, and the throne of the Ottoman Empire is once again occupied by someone very young, very intense, and very, very done with everyone's nonsense. We've arrived at the reign of Murad IV. Murad IV became sultan in 1623 at the age of 11. Which, as you might imagine, is not the ideal age to manage rebellious janissaries, provincial revolts, Persian wars, palace intrigue, and a deeply complicated succession system. So, in the early years, the empire was effectively run by his mother, Kösem Sultan. Now, Kösem Sultan deserves a slow nod of respect. She was one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, intelligent, strategic, calm under pressure. While her son was technically on the throne, she navigated court politics with impressive steadiness. If the empire was a ship in choppy water, she was quietly adjusting the sails while everyone else argued about who held the map. But as Murad grew older, something shifted. He did not become a gentle poet king. He did not drift into mystical reflection like his grandfather Murad III. No. Murad IV developed a personality that historians often describe as forceful. The empire in the 1620s was dealing with serious instability. The janissaries had grown powerful enough to depose and kill sultans. Osman II's fate was still fresh in everyone's memory. Provincial revolts, known as the Salali uprisings, had shaken Anatolia. Persia had taken advantage of Ottoman weakness to reclaim territory. Murad looked around at this situation and apparently decided that subtlety was overrated. By his late teens, he began consolidating power personally, and when we say consolidating, we mean eliminating opposition with very direct methods. He cracked down on corruption, he punished rebellious officials, he executed those he deemed disloyal, swiftly, publicly, calmly, in that very Ottoman way, where everything is done with formal procedure and embroidered robes. And then he did something unexpectedly domestic. He banned coffee. Yes, coffee. Now, coffee houses in Istanbul were social hubs. People gathered there to talk politics, gossip, complain about taxes, and debate religious matters, which, from Murad's perspective, probably looked like a room full of potential conspirators caffeinating themselves into revolutionary enthusiasm. So he banned coffee houses. He also banned tobacco and alcohol, which is slightly ironic because earlier sultans had been known to enjoy all three. But Murad's approach to leadership was less, let's relax with a goblet, and more about, why is anyone relaxing at all? There are stories, perhaps exaggerated, that Murad would disguise himself and wander the streets at night to catch people violating these bans. If he found someone drinking or smoking, punishment could be severe. Imagine being a citizen of Istanbul in the 1630s. You just want a quiet cup of coffee, and somewhere out there your sultan might be personally checking. It adds a certain edge to bedtime beverages. But Murad IV was not simply a strict moral enforcer. He was also a capable military leader. In 1638, he personally led a campaign against the Safavid Empire and recaptured Baghdad. This was significant. Baghdad was symbolically and strategically important. Its recapture restored some of the prestige that had faded in previous decades. Murad marched with the army. He commanded directly. He reasserted the old warrior sultan image. For a moment, it felt like a return to earlier Ottoman energy. And yet, the intensity of his rule carried its own cost. Murad reportedly had several of his own brothers executed, including princes who might one day challenge his authority. The old logic of fratricide had not vanished completely. It had merely been paused. One brother survived, Ibrahim, and we'll come back to him. Murad's health began to decline in his late 20s, years of stress, possibly heavy drinking despite his own bans. Yes, that irony again. The sources are divided. But by 1640, at the age of just 27, Murad IV died. 27. He left behind no surviving sons, which meant the throne passed to the one brother he had spared. That brother was Ibrahim. Now, let's lower the lights slightly, because Ibrahim's story is unusual. Ibrahim had spent much of his life confined in the cafes, isolated, listening to distant palace movements, watching brothers disappear one by one, never certain if he would be next.
When Murad IV died, officials reportedly had to reassure Ibrahim that this was not a trap, that he was not being summoned for execution, that he was, in fact, about to become sultan. That's the psychological environment we're working with. Ibrahim's reign quickly gained a reputation for instability. Some chroniclers describe him as emotionally volatile. Others suggest he suffered from severe anxiety or trauma due to years of confinement. He developed certain preferences. He was fascinated by fur, luxurious sable furs in particular. He demanded enormous quantities. He also reportedly became obsessed with the weight of his concubines, favoring women of larger size. Palace officials scrambled to accommodate these tastes, because when the sultan wants something oddly specific, one does not gently suggest moderation. Meanwhile, state affairs suffered. Corruption increased, court factions fought for influence, the treasury strained under extravagant spending and ongoing military pressures. And then there was Ottoman Sultan, still present, still politically experienced, the mother of Murad IV and Ibrahim. She had guided one son through chaos. Now she found herself managing another son whose unpredictability posed a different challenge. Eventually, patience within the empire ran thin. In 1648, after military setbacks and mounting dissatisfaction, Ibrahim was deposed, and then executed. It was the same cycle we've seen before. The throne giveth, the throne taketh away. His young son was placed on the throne instead. That child was Mehmed IV. Mehmed IV was only 6 years old. 6, which meant the empire once again entered a regency period, and once again, Ottoman Sultan stepped into power, this time as grandmother to the sultan. But palace politics had grown even more tangled. Another powerful woman emerged, Turhan Sultan, Mehmed IV's mother. And soon, the empire would witness not just military campaigns and administrative reforms, but a deadly struggle between two queen mothers. Yes, the palace was about to become even quieter and sharper. As we gently close Part 4, imagine Murad IV's Istanbul. Coffee houses shuttered, soldiers marching, citizens glancing nervously over their shoulders. Then imagine Ibrahim's palace, rooms piled with furs, anxious advisors whispering in corners. The Ottoman Empire remains vast. Its borders still stretch impressively across maps, but inside the palace, the atmosphere feels increasingly fragile, less about expansion, more about survival. In the next part, we'll float into the reign of Mehmed IV, the child sultan, and the strange, almost theatrical power struggle between the women who tried to control the empire from behind lattice screens. Because in this dynasty, strength is never simple, and peace is always temporary.